The evening light had that late amber color that makes the kitchen feel smaller and quieter. I was sitting at the table with a cup of tea going lukewarm, sorting through the day's mail, bills, flyers, a grocery coupon, and then one envelope that looked too official to ignore. It said, "For your information, estate accounts." I thought it must be a duplicate, some end-of-year summary. But when I unfolded the bank statement, the numbers didn't sit right. The balance was off, lower by more than it should have been. At first, I assumed I'd misread it. I put on my glasses, but there it was again, a withdrawal I didn't recognize, a date I didn't remember. The air in the kitchen shifted. I could hear the refrigerator hum and my own breath. Harold and I had trusted that account to be safe, sealed, steady. That was the whole point of good planning, to never be surprised again. But this was a surprise with a heartbeat. Have you ever felt secure until a single page told you a different story? And when I peered at the transaction on the last page, my throat went dry. Now, I want to stop right here for a second. This isn't gossip. It's not a scandal story. It's about what happens when the systems that promise to protect you, banks, families, paperwork, suddenly speak a language you don't remember learning. I'm Evelyn Hart, and this is the story of how one quiet envelope tried to rewrite my peace of mind. If you've ever had to make sense of a bank line or a family promise, go ahead and like this video. It helps more people find these stories. And if you've ever thought, that could never happen to me, well, I used to think the same thing. So pour yourself a cup of tea, sit close, and let's walk through it together. Slow, honest, one detail at a time. Sometimes the hardest fights start with a single ledger and a promise. So let me tell you why a bank statement became the beginning of a long, careful fight. Morning starts the same way it always has in this house. The kettle hums its low whistle, and the radio mumbles a soft old tune from the 60s. I keep the same station every day, not because I love every song, but because I like the voices. They remind me of steadiness, of something that's been around longer than me and plans to keep on going. The air smells faintly of toast, and the clock ticks like it's counting heartbeats. I open the curtains a few inches, just enough light, not too much, and I straighten the lace runner on the sideboard. Everything in this house has a place, and I take comfort in keeping those places right. After breakfast, I slip on my sweater, the one with a button missing, and step out to the porch. The geraniums are still damp from last night's rain. I water them anyway. Habit, I guess. I always tell myself the plants can tell when someone cares. Thomas Harold's middle name, but only I called him that. Used to plant them every spring. He said red flowers looked like courage. Every year, I keep them alive for both of us. After the plants comes the mailbox. I always check it before the sun gets too high. It's one of those small rituals that give the day a spine. The box creaks when I open it, and sometimes a spider startles out, as though guarding secrets. Most days, it's just circulars, bills, and coupons. I stack them neatly by type, same as always. Then, I return to the kitchen, the kettle refilled, the pen sitting ready by the notepad. I keep my records in a drawer near the stove. Receipts, pension letters, small statements, all labeled by month. My children tease me about it. They say, "Mom, no one keeps paper anymore." But I like paper. Paper feels honest. It holds the same shape you left it in. I sat down that morning to file away last week's bank statement when I noticed a new envelope, thicker paper, official letterhead, estate accounts in tidy print. It didn't have the usual return address, just the words "For your information." My stomach made a small twist. I put it aside, told myself I'd open it after I checked the radio weather. But my eyes kept finding it again. You ever have a letter stare at you from across the table? Finally, I slid a knife through the top. The paper had that faint chemical scent of new ink. I unfolded it, expecting routine numbers, interest, balance, signature, nothing special. But halfway down the page, something caught. The balance was smaller, not slightly, but meaningfully. I blinked, adjusted my glasses, looked again, and there it was. A withdrawal, not mine. No initials, no authorization note. The house, which had been humming a small, steady song all morning, the kettle, the radio, the clock, went strangely quiet inside me. The house sings its small songs until paper changes the tune. Then, I read the line that didn't belong, a withdrawal with my name missing from it. I grew up in a world where paper and people meant the same thing. You kept them both neat and honest. My father worked the freight docks in Toledo. Every Friday, he came home with a crumpled envelope in his coat pocket. He'd sit down, empty it out, count every dollar, and hand my mother half without saying a word. That was their system. Simple, sturdy, fair. Asterisk mom kept a ledger in pencil. Groceries in one column, utilities in another, church donations in the third. When times were tight, she wrote smaller to make the page last longer. She used to tell me, "You can tell a lot about a person by how they treat their numbers." By the time I was 16, I could balance a household budget without a calculator. I believed in the kind of order that keeps fear out of the room. Then came Harold. I met him at a church picnic under an oak tree that's long gone now. He offered me the last slice of pie. It was lemon meringue, too sweet, but he said, "I like things that take patience." I suppose that line worked, because a year later, I was wearing his ring. We started with nothing but faith and a savings account we opened together. Every decision was shared, even the small ones. We wrote notes to each other in the margins of our budget books. Fix roof soon, or buy extra jam for Sunday. He taught me that stewardship wasn't about money. It was about caring enough to plan. Our early years were lean, but we never missed a bill. We believed that keeping good records was a kind of respect for each other, for the work it took to earn, and when things grew easier, we stayed the same. No secrets, no shortcuts. When he passed, I thought I was stepping into a chapter we had already outlined together. Every account named, every will signed, every form notarized. That was our covenant. So when I saw that strange withdrawal, it wasn't just about money. It was about what those numbers stood for, the years of trust that those columns had represented. Harold used to say, "Trust is a record you keep, not a thing you assume." I never imagined that record would be footnoted by someone else's hand. We built our life the slow, American way, a paycheck at a time, a meal at a table. There were PTA meetings, Christmas parades, fundraisers where I baked pies that never quite cooled before the auction. Harold ran the books for a local hardware store, and I kept house. It was a partnership of small, steady duties. We were never rich, but we had enough, and enough felt like plenty. The house was paid off early. We had a savings account, a pension, and later, a little foundation Harold advised for veterans and youth projects. It made him proud, that bit of giving back. But over time, little silences crept in, the kind you don't notice at first. Phone calls that used to be daily became weekly. Paperwork that used to sit on our shared desk started showing up in sealed envelopes. He said it was just details, tax forms, renewals, small things. I didn't press. You learn, in long marriages, to trust that people mean well even when they get secretive about their burdens. Still, I'd sometimes see him staring at the same statement longer than usual, tapping his pen in that slow, worried way. "You all right?" I'd ask. "Fine," he'd say, and slide the page under another dot after he passed. I found those pages again, tucked into folders, neat but too tidy, as though they were arranged for someone else's eyes. You don't see the day the ledger begins to change. You only notice the balance when it's thin. And in the bottom drawer, beneath birthday cards and tax receipts, I found a single folded slip, a bank receipt. On the back, in Harold's careful script, a note I had never seen before: "Transfer complete. For trust, keep confidential." I sat at the kitchen table and dialed the bank like someone reading the fine print on a contract they'd trusted for years. The phone hummed a polite tone. When the teller came on, she had that soft, trained voice people in finance used to make numbers sound harmless. I told her the account in question, and waited while she typed. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Hart," she said. "There was a withdrawal posted last month. It was a large transfer to the Hart Community Foundation." I blinked. The foundation, Harold had served on that board years ago. It had been one of the things he was proud of. "We thought they'd keep it safe," he'd said. "Trusted them." "May I see the authorization?" I asked. There was a pause long enough to make me fold my hands. "Let me see," the teller said. "I need to pull the request." One moment. Moments in bankhold music stretched like shadows. When she returned, her voice had an edge of corporate caution. "We have records," she said, "but I'll need manager approval to release signature copies. Standard procedure." It felt like a small delay. I told her to do what she needed. Then I asked the important question: when was the transfer dated? She read numbers slowly. 2 days after Mr. Hart passed. Processed the following week. 2 days. My mouth went dry. Harold had been careful with timing. He'd always said, "Never make sudden moves with what keeps a life steady." I pictured him at the kitchen table, balancing bills under the lamp, the same way I pictured him carving spoons in the shop. The date lodged like a stone. "Why so soon?" I asked, softer. Did the foundation request it? Was there a note? We have a transfer request form, she answered. It appears complete. Asterisk complete. Processed. The words sounded official and final, but they did not satisfy the small, hungry part of me that needed to know why. I remembered a conversation years ago. Harold had spoken of the foundation as the right place to leave certain funds. He trusted them to use money for veterans and youth. That made sense. But trusts and transfers are built on paperwork that should line up with intent. The ledger should make sense when a loved one leaves. I asked for copies of the forms and the signatures. The teller typed again. I can request them, she said, but it will require manager sign-off because it involves a deceased client's account. Protocol protects the estate from fraudulent requests. Protocol, protection, both words that sound kind and slow you down. I thanked her and hung up, suddenly feeling very small in a system designed to be careful above all else. That night the house was quieter. The kettle hissed. The clock ticked. I spread Harold's papers on the table, the old receipts, and the letters from the foundation. I could feel the pattern of his life in them. Small gifts, sponsoring a bench, sponsoring tools for the community shop. A large transfer 2 days after his death did not match the way we had always planned things, with notice, with conversation. So I slept poorly and woke with a resolve that felt like a small rope in my hand. If paperwork is trust made tangible, then I would follow the paper. I would ask for each page. I would not let a ledger be the last word on his intentions. My hands didn't tremble, but something inside me did. The day after the bank call, I started ringing people who might know something. Family first. My daughter picked up on the second ring. Her voice was full of that careful calm people use to spare elders from worry. We're handling things, Mom, she said. The foundation has been in touch. They told us it was what Dad wanted. Did he tell you? I asked. There was a pause that said more than words. He mentioned some plans, she said, but not details. Another pause. We're trying to respect his wishes. Respect. The word sat between us like a placard. I tried not to press. Then I called Harold's niece. She answered quickly, voice low. A week before Dad's hospital stay, he called Mr. Pope late at night. She told me, sounded worried, said he wanted to be sure money was in the right place. Late-night calls have a flavor to them. They mean urgency. They mean something a person chose to do away from the light of normal hours. I made a note. Neighbors were kind in different ways. At the corner store, Mrs. Bowers lowered her voice. Saw Mr. Hart walking down to Pope's office one afternoon. She said, car was in the lot twice that week. People nodded sympathetically and always added, he was trying to be helpful. Their kindness felt like a soft cloak that also hid what I needed to see. I went back to the bank with those leads in hand. The teller met me with a folder and a solemn expression. She had copies of the transfer request, but one page was missing from the sequence. The authorization page where a signature should have been. We have an incomplete set, she said. Sometimes documents are logged separately if they're submitted later. Later, the word made my chest ache. Papers are supposed to line up. A neat film strip of decisions. A missing authorization page could mean an administrative lag, or it could mean someone had neglected to follow procedure, or worse, it could mean someone had chosen convenience over clarity. I asked if the bank had records of who accessed the safe deposit or the file. They checked. There were entries, but some were coded and required managerial clearance to disclose. I requested that clearance. Meanwhile, I contacted the foundation, calmly, like someone who wanted to believe the gentlest explanation. They were polite and forthcoming at first. Mr. Hart had been generous, the secretary said. He made arrangements. I told them I wanted to see the request forms and any memos about the transfer. She promised to get back to me. I waited and watched the small town orbit around the question, and then slowly move on. People were protective in the way towns can be protective. They bandage things without showing you the wound. Silence in small towns often sounds like protection or avoidance. I felt both. I felt like someone who had been left outside of a conversation that most had decided to settle without me. So I drove to the foundation office myself. The doors were locked. A small sign said, by appointment only. A stamped envelope sat on the stoop, marked with an internal file number. I picked it up and felt the paper's roughness under my fingers. And then I found a closed file drawer. And a stamped envelope inside. The foundation office smelled like dust and waxed floors. Sunlight came in the high windows in strips. A volunteer unlocked the door when I knocked and led me to a small desk where old ledgers lay stacked like quiet history. They looked official and humble at the same time. a kind of paper dignity that made me want to treat them carefully. I asked to see records tied to Harold's name. The ledger was a columned thing, neat and stern. But as I ran my finger down the entries, I noticed overlaps. Donations, transfers. One page showed a transfer with the amount that matched the bank withdrawal. Next to it, in tiny script, was an initial I didn't recognize. A second line showed a deposit to a secondary account. And the dates were staggered in a way that suggested internal movement. I found a slip from the bank, stamped and dated after Harold's last trip to town. The secretary stood near, hands folded. She offered a practiced answer. "We have an emergency operations clause," she said. "In the event of an estate needing immediate assistance, the board can authorize releases to ensure commitments are met." The phrase sounded comforting. Emergency operations sound like saving lives. But I'd been used to following the forms. Emergency clauses are supposed to be rare. This one had been used quickly. I kept looking. Tucked between pages was a typed note, almost private. Pope assured me he'd cover Taxbridge. Confidential. The handwriting was not Harold's. It read like a quick scrawl to a friend. The idea of a private promise between two men, a handshake and a note, made the paper feel less gentle and more sharp. I asked the secretary who Pope was. She named the foundation director. He was a man who had run the board for years and enjoyed the trust of a lot of folks. People often describe him as practical. Practical can mean efficient. Practical can also mean someone who makes choices without asking everyone around the table. I left with copies of pages that smelled of ink and old coffee. The ledger raised more questions than it solved. Why the internal transfer? Why the confidential note? Who else had seen it? Paper can be gentle in tone and sharp in consequence. I felt the edges. That night I called a lawyer recommended by a friend from the church. She listened and asked for what I had. "We can subpoena records," she said. "But subpoenas cost money, and they make waves." I thanked her and put the phone down. My suspicion had edged into a plan. It wasn't righteous fury. It was practical resolve, the kind of resolve Harold would have respected. If a private promise had been wrapped into a public action, then the town deserved to know the terms. And if paperwork had been arranged that obscured those terms, then the ledger needed a light. So I set about gathering the pieces: the bank copy, the foundation pages, the note. When I asked about the initials, the secretary handed me a photograph from a dinner I hadn't been invited to. The photograph was glossy and warm in my hand. Harold in a jacket, laughing at something someone off-frame had said. Beside him, men and women I knew. The foundation director, a couple of trustees, a local politician smiling with a ribbon in hand. The caption on the back said, "Heart Fundraiser August." The faces looked proud. They looked like people who had spent nights worrying about grant legs and fundraising strategies. That image alone could have been the picture of a good man doing good work. When I took the photo to the next meeting at the town hall, trustees leaned forward and nodded. "Mr. Hart was a benefactor," one said. "He wanted the money to be used for veterans and educational workshops. We're honoring his intent." I tried to keep my tone even. "Then why does the ledger show internal movement? Why a transfer after he died? And why am I not consulted?" I asked. They answered with benevolent phrases: stewardship, efficiency, honoring the will of the deceased. It is remarkable, I thought, how bureaucratic words can feel like balm. But balm is not the same as explanation. A trustee suggested mediation. "We can appoint an independent auditor," he said. "Let's avoid public spectacle." People in the town began to murmur. I felt the press of whispers at the post office and at the church. Some offered support, others looked away. A folded note arrived at my door from someone I'd known for years. It read simply, "There's one more file in the lawyer's safe." The handwriting was an old hand, shaky and small. I went to the lawyer. He was a mild man who preferred slow conversation to loud pronouncements. He opened a safe and pulled out a thin file. Inside was an authorization, a page stamped with what looked like a signature, dated after Harold's passing. The signature was not his. Whoever signed it had authority on paper. Whoever signed it had changed the flow of money. The moment felt heavy in a way I had not expected. This was no longer a gentle neighborhood mystery. It smelled like calculus for reputations. Generosity is a beautiful thing, but generosity and secrecy can wear the same coat, and when they do, the coat can hide many things. I wanted witnesses who would speak plainly and papers arranged in order, so the town could see truth and not only assumption. So I began to gather witnesses. My niece remembered Harold's late-night call. The foundation's former treasurer, now retired and soft-spoken, agreed to meet and tell me what he remembered about the emergency clause. Each account filled in a line on a map I was drawing under the lamp. Patience would be my tool, evidence, my proof, asterisk, asterisk, and then the neighbor slid me a folded note. There's one more file in the lawyer's safe. Deadlines have a way of making things urgent that weren't urgent before. Once the foundation filed for disbursement, the clock began to count down in ways I could feel in my bones. The bank told me there was a narrow window to file a formal objection. The town council scheduled a hearing to ratify the disposition. Notices went up on bulletin boards and in the library window. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion and a timetable. Neighbors began to urge me, one way or another. Some said, "Let it go. It's his wish." Others, who had always liked how I kept records, whispered, "You should contest it." The town tends toward consensus. They like things decided without too much turbulence. I had never enjoyed making waves, but I'd always said I'd make time for truth. The choice now felt heavy. I called the lawyer and asked him to look at the safe deposit log, the record of entries to the vault where original transfers and authorizations are kept. The lawyer's face changed when he saw the dates. He walked me through the entries. Not only had someone accessed the files close to the date of the transfer, but there was an additional signature recorded after Harold passed. The register showed a name I did not recognize, and the timestamp was after Harold's death. After death, signatures are the sort that make a person's stomach drop. They are not necessarily fraudulent, but they demand justification. Who had authority? Under what clause? Was there a power of attorney that I had not known about? The questions stacked. The lawyer advised caution. "You can file an injunction," he said. "You can subpoena the records, and we can seek an audit. But expect to spend money and time." I thought of the small savings we'd left, of Harold's pension, of the way money stretches differently in later years. I had to be practical. I also had to be honest. Pressure mounted from the council. They said the workshop needed funds for its next quarter. Veterans were lined up for classes. Delays could hurt people who needed help. That, of course, matters. When charity has deadlines, you must weigh the harm of delay against the harm of unchecked transfers. I understood that. I wanted to protect both the cause and the covenant. Deadlines make decisions visible like noon, revealing every crack. I debated the choices in the small morning light, counting out possibilities and their costs. Sue and tie up the funds in court for months, mediate and seek a settlement, or accept and hope the foundation will operate transparently. None of the options felt clean. I asked the lawyer to look at the safe deposit log, and found a signature dated after Harold died. The subpoena came back faster than I expected. The bank courier brought a neat stack of copied records tied with twine, like some antique novel no one had read in years. I laid the pages out across the table, each one lined with Harold's tidy, familiar initials. The pattern was clear enough once I slowed my breathing and read from top to bottom. He had arranged something called a conditional gift, funds to be transferred only if a parcel of land sold, and only if the proceeds were used for a veteran's woodworking workshop. That sounded exactly like him. He'd been one of those quiet men who believed skill kept pride alive. He used to say, "Give a man tools, and he'll remember he's worth something." But the deeper I read, the stranger it became. The gift had conditions, and someone else had added amendments. A clause authorizing accelerated use of discretionary resources appeared in small print. That clause carried the signature of the foundation's director, not Harold's. Below that, in faint ink, was a notation linking to another account, a secondary fund, with a different beneficiary. The handwriting was too rushed to be Harold's. My stomach tightened. I took the papers to the lawyer's office. He spread them out like a jigsaw puzzle. "See here," he said, tapping the small initials beside the transfer lines. "These two happened before the sale. This one," he pointed to the later date, "happened after." After, always that word. He turned the paper toward me. "Mrs. Hart, I don't think this was fraud. I think your husband trusted the wrong language." I stared at the ink, at the word accelerate. Bureaucratic mercy. They called it a way to move funds faster to community need. But moving faster can sometimes mean skipping permission. I drove home and sat in Harold's old chair. The paper crinkled under my hands. I looked around the quiet room. His photo, his books, the sunlight still slanting across the floorboards. All those years, we had written things down to keep them safe, to make them clear. Now clarity had become its own kind of weapon. Sometimes, a ledger entry rearranges what you thought you knew about a life. I thought I knew everything about the man I'd built a life with, but here was proof of trust stretched thin, intentions bent by procedure, generosity caught between rules and reality. Word travels fast when a woman asks too many questions. At first, it was polite advice disguised as care. Evelyn, honey, maybe let it go. It's for a good cause. Then it turned into distance. Church friends stopped saving me a seat. Invitations slowed. Conversations ended when I entered a room. I wasn't angry, just bewildered. People mistake persistence for conflict when they don't want the story disturbed. I poured my energy into collecting documents, calling the bank, visiting the courthouse. Every clerk knew my name before I spoke. One afternoon, the grocer, a kind man, whispered, "You're making folks nervous. Mrs. Hart, they say you're stirring old pots." I smiled, paid for my apples, and walked home with that phrase echoing. Stirring old pots. Maybe they forgot the stew was still cooking. The loneliness was sharp. Even kindness started to sound like warning. I'd always believed truth brought people closer, but now it was costing me company. Still, I couldn't let the record stand crooked. Harold's legacy and the dignity of what he'd meant to build were being rewritten in fine print. I told myself I'd rather be lonely with truth than surrounded by comfort built on a lie. That's when the envelope came. No return address. Plain paper. Inside, a single sheet typed on an old machine. The words were brief. Be careful what you uncover. Some things were meant to stay buried. My hands didn't shake, but my resolve solidified, like concrete. There's quiet courage in choosing the truth over easy peace. By mid-March, it felt like the whole town had an opinion about my crusade. The trustees met weekly. The council asked for statements. My lawyer began to sound tired. "You're up against a system that prefers paperwork to conscience," he warned. The foundation's director sent a letter offering mediation. "Let's resolve this amicably," he wrote. "The community's goodwill matters most." I could almost hear the smile in the phrasing. A retired judge from church, Mr. Callahan, offered advice. "Don't lose your temper," he said. "Make them read it aloud. People believe what's printed more than what's felt." So I prepared my papers for a public hearing. The town hall smelled like varnish and tension. I stood at the front with the ledger open for everyone to see. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I read the entries one by one, showing the mismatched dates, the added initials, the missing clauses. You could hear the breathing in the room. I told them this wasn't about accusation. It was about stewardship. If this money was meant for veterans, I said, then let it serve them cleanly, without confusion. Asterisk, asterisk, the judge nodded once. The room exhaled. The hearing ended with a vote to order an independent audit. It wasn't victory, but it was daylight. You can't change the past, but you can insist on the truth being seen. As people filed out, one of the trustees, a woman I'd known since high school, lingered. She pressed a small envelope into my hand. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered. Inside was a photograph. Harold, seated at a dinner table with the director and two others, looking proud, but the date printed at the bottom was weeks after he'd been hospitalized. After the hearing, the days blurred, sleep thinned. The house felt like a waiting room, silent, neutral, tired. I'd won the audit, but at what cost? Friends gone distant, neighbors cautious, lawyers billing by the hour. I started to wonder if maybe Harold's choice had been his to make, however flawed. Maybe dragging it into daylight was just cruelty dressed as virtue. That's the danger with truth. It can clean or it can cut. One sleepless night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of papers. The clock glowed 3:11 a.m. I heard Harold's voice, or maybe just memory's echo. "Be kind, Evie, but don't be naive." I didn't know which side I'd landed on. Morning came gray and thin. I made coffee and forced myself to go outside. The world still existed. Robins hopping near the hedge, a neighbor's car door slamming, a newspaper landing on the walk. I was still here. Then, the phone rang. A man's voice, shaky, young, said, "Mrs. Hart, my name's Dale. I work at the Veterans Workshop your husband helped start." I said yes, waiting. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "The fund covered my training. I've got steady work now. If it weren't for Mr. Hart, I'd still be lost." The kitchen light seemed softer then. Gratitude has a way of clearing fog. That call didn't erase the wrongs, but it reminded me of why any of it mattered. For one long night I wondered if honesty was an act of cruelty or care. Now I knew it could be both, and still be right. The text came from a number I didn't know. When I arrived at the post office, the lot was empty except for one car. A woman stepped out, glasses, gray coat, steady eyes. "Mrs. Hart," she asked, "I worked with your husband in accounting." She held a manila envelope. Inside was a full ledger, transactions, memos, annotations, everything the audit hadn't yet revealed. One line stood out: funds reallocated from the veterans account to administrative consulting. The signatures matched the director's, not Harold's. She handed me proof when I was about to give up, and that changed how I moved forward. My lawyer and I spent the next 2 days drafting a mediation plan. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about realignment. We proposed restoring the money to the Veterans Program and assigning an independent trustee. The foundation could continue its work under supervision and in sunlight. We called it the repair motion. The town would get its workshop. The gift would honor Harold's intent. And maybe, just maybe, trust could find its footing again. The morning of the hearing, the town hall felt like a church on a big day. Rain had stopped but left the air washed and sharp. People came with umbrellas tucked under arms, children clutching coloring books so they'd be quiet, men in work boots and women in sensible coats. The room filled with the small noises a town makes when it gathers: the scrape of chairs, the clink of a coffee cup, the hush that says everyone knows this matters. I sat where the sun could find me by the window. My lawyer arranged papers in a neat stack. The foundation's director was there with his counsel, polished and calm. Trustees lined up like a chorus, ready with phrases about stewardship and mission and the greater good. I felt a hum of nerves run under my ribs, a steady pull like a clock winding tight. We began with the ledger. I read the entries aloud slowly, the way you read scripture when you want each line to settle: dates, transfers, notes. I pointed to the after-death signature and asked, plainly, for an accounting of authority. The room listened. The trustee who'd slipped me the photograph sat with his hands folded. His jaw moved when the director explained emergency clauses and discretion. He said they'd acted to get funds to programs that needed them. The judge, a steady woman with a voice that made nonsense feel small, listened to everyone and then asked the question that bent the air: was Mr. Hart's intent honored in practice, and was procedure followed so the estate was protected? She asked it with a civility that insisted on truth. The foundation's lawyer spoke of intent and impact. He described classes planned and material bought. He spoke of veterans trained and jobs found. His words had weight. Then witnesses rose. The retired treasurer told of an internal memo that advised temporary release in certain circumstances. The niece read a note Harold had scribbled about caring for veterans. A young man from the workshop stood and said, "My hands know that money made a difference." That last line landed like a small bell. But testimony is not just words. Paper is a witness to. The audit revealed the transfers into a secondary account bearing a different beneficiary name. It revealed reimbursements and a late-signed authorization that did not match Harold's usual script. The judge pressed on those differences. She asked the director to explain why the acceleration clause had been used and why communication with the family had been limited. Under pressure, the director's calm shifted. He admitted fear about rising maintenance and taxes. He said he'd thought rapid action was mercy. He said he'd meant well. You can see the human in such words. You can also see where mercy becomes shortcut. The judge looked at both sides and then proposed a path that would hold both truth and practical care. She requested a mediated settlement, restore funds clearly intended for the Veterans Workshop, appoint an independent trustee to oversee create a transparent reporting system that included family oversight, and establish a small advisory role for the Harts. The state to honor Harold's name. It was not the moment of righteous vindication I had imagined in quiet hours. It was quieter, steadier. It was a civic repair crafted by professionals who preferred paperwork to drama. The room read the settlement, line by line, and then the judge asked for the vote. Hands were raised. The vote was narrow, a few yeses, some reluctant noes, but it passed. When the gavel landed, the room exhaled. I felt it like a wind moving through curtains. My daughter, who had sat rigid and watchful, reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were warm, and they squeezed in a way that said more than words. Outside, someone clapped awkwardly. Inside, a man from the workshop wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Justice in small towns is often quiet, but it still rings true when it does. I did not dance or shout. I simply let the steadiness of it sink into me. My lawyer shook my hand. The director approached with a look that was part apology and part relief. The mediator outlined the steps. We all agreed to terms that day: restitution for the Veterans Fund, an independent trustee, monthly reporting, and a role for the family. Walking out, the rain had stopped entirely. The pavement steamed. Neighbors nodded as they passed. Some mouthed congratulations. Others looked away. All of it felt human. When the judge read the settlement, the room exhaled and my daughter reached across the table to hold my hand. The weeks after the settlement were quieter, in a good way. The machinery of fixing things is mostly small acts. Paperwork signed, accounts reconciled, meetings scheduled. The foundation accepted the independent trustee. The trustee opened the books for public view. The names of vendors, invoices, and program plans were listed on a page I could read. We organized a small opening for the Veterans Woodworking Workshop. It was Tuesday morning, mild and bright, with treats laid out on a folding table and a ribbon stretched across the door. I was asked to cut it. My hands were steady. I thought of Harold and how he'd have grinned at the sight of benches and tool racks gleaming with oil. The man who once scared at stairs now elbowed aside the future and smiled. He would have liked that children from the school came by to see the tools and to hear about how someone could learn a trade and make something. Men who had known rougher days showed up with their caps in hand. We had sandwiches and coffee, and a woman who'd learned to carve came forward to show a small spoon she'd made. The room was full of noise that felt like mending. I took my place as a sort of volunteer steward, which was a role that worked for me. It gave me a reason to be there without making me the boss. I kept a copy of the ledger in my kitchen drawer. There was a neat rubber band around it now, a symbol that, yes, papers can be orderly again. I went to meetings, checked the quarterly reports, and sometimes I walked through the workshop just to see people working with tools. Under bright lights, life at home softened in similar ways. The kettles sang in the morning, and I learned to expect the small joys: the neighbor dropping off a jar of jam, the mail carrier waving, my granddaughter charging in with a drawing. The sounds that had once felt like alarms now felt like the ordinary music of a place that had been tested and held. One afternoon, long after things had quieted, I was putting away a drawer of Harold's tools for display when my fingers brushed against a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath an old socket wrench. It was thin and browned with time. My hands went cool before I opened it, as if the paper itself had weight. Inside, Harold had written a short note in a scrawl I knew as well as any song. "Evie," it read, "if this finds you, know I meant to do right. Keep the porch light. H." The note didn't explain everything. It didn't absolve mysteries. But it was an honesty of its own, a small attempt at tenderness and intent. I sat with the note for a long time, and then pinned it to the inside of the workshop ledger. Some things, it seems, stay complicated. Some things carry both mistake and care. Holding both is the work of being a neighbor, a widow, a custodian of memory. But inside a drawer I found a folded note Harold had kept, and it changed how I remembered him. When you live a long life, as I have, you learn that stories are not tidy. They are stitched from choices, good and bad, and sometimes they unravel in public. What I learned through this is both small and large. Keep your papers. Speak plainly. Choose the people who will steward what you leave. I tell people now, it isn't unromantic to talk about bank accounts or trustees. It's kind. It's merciful. If you love someone, tell them where the deed is. Tell them who the lawyer is. Name your trustees in conversation, not in silence. Make sure people know how you meant your gifts to be used. A plan that is clear is a plan that can't be easily turned into someone else's story. I also learned how humility matters. When we recovered funds for the Veterans Workshop, I didn't cheer so much as I breathed. The work mattered to other people. The men who showed up to learn a trade mattered. Restoring money to their program felt like restoring a small piece of dignity. That's as good a public benefit as any. There is courage in asking for truth and grace in offering it. When a foundation director says he acted out of fear, you must hear both the confession and the need that caused it. People are complicated. Our systems are imperfect. The fix is in public oversight and in conversations behind closed doors that are later put on the record. So, practical advice, if you'll take it, from someone who's been around kitchens and ledgers: make a list, label a file, tell a relative and a lawyer, make your wishes plain, leave nothing to guesswork. And if you find a mismatch in a ledger, don't assume malice right away, assume mistake. then test it. Call witnesses. Ask for records. Be patient, but be persistent. Asterisk. My final thought is this. Love is not just a feeling. It's paperwork sometimes. It's visiting, recording, appointing, and telling. It's the small acts that make a life legible to those who come after. Don't let silence write your ending. Let clarity preserve the story. And maybe the ledger that hurt me most became the proof that saved life. The video we made about this, the one where I sat at my kitchen table and read pages with my voice, brought messages I didn't expect. They came in like little lanterns across the screen. People wrote, "Thank you. I checked my mom's papers," or "We started a community records night." A woman in Vermont said she'd found her father's letters. A man in Ohio said he finally called his sister. People began small projects. Libraries offered a free how-to on wills. A church set up a legal aid day. Neighbors swapped names of trustworthy accountants. The ripple moved from porch to porch, from mailbox to mailbox, the way kindness does. It was humbling and gentle proof that one quiet fight can teach a lot of people how to protect their own small lives. Stories travel. They teach. They make other people pick up the phone and say the word they'd been avoiding. Let's talk. Months later, I taught a workshop at the town library called Keeping Home and Heart. My granddaughter set out cookies on paper plates. We had handouts. Where to keep deeds. How to label photos. Whom to call for help. People brought boxes of old papers. They shared stories. We laughed. We cried. The veterans' workshop thrived. The men taught children to sand wood and finish a spoon. There were quiet afternoons when the room smelled of sawdust and honey, and the sound of learning, very like the sound of mending. The town learned to hold private promises and public good together. I kept Harold's little note in my ledger, not as proof of everything, but as a reminder of imperfect love. Life is not tidy, but it can be careful. Thank you for sitting with me. If you'll do one small thing this week, check where an important paper is kept and tell a loved one. Drop a comment with one document you'll review: will, deed, power of attorney. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more. Next Sunday, the quilt that found its way home. Because every promise deserves a keeper, and every story deserves to be told. For those who keep homes, and those who help preserve them, thank you for listening.